Hi everybody, it's Brian here with a Fusion 360 quick tip. So we're going to specifically look at the extrude command and some of the options that weren't covered inside the lessons that we talked about with the extrude command. So we are going to do a very simple geometry here. We're just going to have Fusion 360 open, create a new sketch. Doesn't really matter what plane. I'm just going to choose the top plane as a default. We're going to choose the rectangle command and just draw in a rectangle. We don't really need to care too much about the size, but we'll give it some dimensions. 80 by 100. That sounds good, but it doesn't really matter here. This is really all about the extrude command. I'm going to finish that sketch and I'm going to go ahead and invoke the extrude feature. I'm going to grab the arrow and let's just extrude this thing, like let's say 25. Okay, so I've extruded this geometry 25 millimeters high, but what I didn't really look at is all of the options inside the extrude feature. So let's go back to the extrude feature and modify it. So I'm going to come down here to extrude on my timeline, right click, go to edit feature, bring up my feature menu, and we can look at some of these things. So obviously the first one, this is just what are you trying to extrude, and I selected that profile. So that's pretty normal. The next one down, which we never really talked about, this is where are you extruding it from? So right now it's saying I'm extruding from my profile plane, the thing that I drew on, right? So I drew on that top plane. We have a couple options. We can offset from that plane, right? So I could click offset from the plane, and then it's going to ask me for a numeric value, and I'm going to say, all right, I want to do 25 millimeters off of that plane. And you'll see what happens is that now it's no longer grounded on that top plane, which is actually sitting down here. It's actually 25 millimeters above that. So that is one of the options that you have. The other thing you have here is from an object. So if you have a drawing that has multiple objects, say I have a rectangle that's down here, and I want this to be offset a certain distance from that object, I select that object, and you can then give it a distance between that object and the thing that you're extruding, and it will do that. In this case, we're going to stick with profile plane so that we can move on to the next option within the feature. And that is this direction option. So right now, it is defaulted to one side, which means it's only going to extrude in one direction. If you click on that, you'll see that we have a couple options there. The second option down is two sides. This would be an asymmetric extrusion. So I can click two sides, and then you'll notice that I now have two arrows, and I can move each one of those independently and change what I'm doing. So I can move one 15 or 25, I can move another one 10 or 15 to get, now my total height is 15 plus 25, right? Which is 40. So I have a total height of 40 here. So that would be another way of doing this. And you'll see kind of the power of this option when you start to have a geometry that you want to have like a center of mass, but maybe the center of mass is not quite symmetrical about what it is you're extruding. So maybe you want to draw on a plane and then have kind of the mass that you're extruding offset from that plane in both directions. So now our center of mass is actually up here, but the drawing plane is a little bit below it. So that's an option. You can also see how we can adjust this with the taper angle, which we'll talk about in just a second. So that's the two-side option. The other option we have here is a symmetrical option. And when I click on symmetrical, again, we're moving to distance as my extent. Underneath that, you'll see the measurement is either a half length or a full length. So here, right now it's defaulted to half length, which means if I put in 25 millimeters here, my full extrusion height is actually 50 millimeters. It's doing 25 on this side of the drawing plane and 25 on this side of the drawing plane for a total of 50. If I don't want to do that math and I know, oh, I want this thing to be 25 total, I can switch to whole length. and now you'll notice it's doing 12.5 above and 12.5 below. So that's a quick switch between those two. Distance, obviously, that we're choosing here is that's the numeric value here. Under extent, we've talked about this a little bit. We can do to all or to a distance. We talked about this a little bit in a previous lesson when we were talking about holes going through an object, and the intent with the hole is that it is always a hole. It isn't just like a counter bore, and so maybe we want to use a to all feature. You can also extrude to all as well. If you're extruding something through an existing geometry, you can choose that. In this case, it doesn't make any sense because we only have that one geometry, so I'm leaving it as distance. The last thing that we have here is this taper angle, and you'll see the taper angle, what this does. So I'm going to actually, before I get into that, I'm going to go back to my direction. I'm going to go to one side, and we'll start to explore taper degree, and I'm going to put in a fairly large number here. I'm going to put in like 20 degrees. And you'll see what that does is it actually tapers out my object 20 degrees from that drawing plane. So this face is actually much larger than the original sketch I drew because it's tapering. I'm going to go back in and edit that feature again. If I type in -20, watch what happens. Whoops, I typed in a 1 instead of a negative. If I type in, ooh, can't find a negative sign, there we go. -20, you'll see that it tapers the other way. This can be really helpful if you are molding something and you want to release something from a mold. So if you have parallel sides, right, if I have 0 degrees of taper and I'm trying to get something out of a mold, this surface is going to get stuck inside my mold. If you're injection molding, this is imperative to have draft, what we call draft, inside injection molding. Typically, you'll see draft maybe between a ½ degree for low volume runs, all the way up to maybe like 2 degrees. It's not super noticeable, but it allows things to come out of the molds faster. But let's do a 20 here so we can start to see that. So again, that is the taper angle. Other thing I want to explore, if we go back to symmetric here, you'll notice now that it's going to take that taper angle, and this plane, my sketch plane on the symmetrical axis, now becomes my parting line. Again, if we're molding something, that would be my parting line. We'd have one half of a mold up here and another half of a mold below it, and that allows my part to come out easily without getting stuck in the mold. You can switch or change maybe where that parting line is by moving to that 2 sides. And this is where you can start to see as we use these things together, maybe I don't want that right in the middle. Maybe I want it, a little bit shifted. And now I have a slightly different parting line, right? So that is the features of the extrude command. I just wanted to cover that a little bit more in depth because we hadn't really gotten into it in the exercises. So hopefully you found that helpful. Hopefully you can start to see how you might be able to use that in the future. And tune in for some more quick tips and some more lessons as we move forward with this Fusion 360 tutorials. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you later.